There has been quite a lot of talk from the car manufacturers, and we've seen some slides referring to it, that 2015 seems to be the magical year. And if you count all the manufacturers doing the announcements, and if they're creating sort of production lines of, I've heard of about 10,000 cars each, then you start doing the numbers, and they come to quite a serious sort of amount if you take them all together. What are you seeing from your perspective? I mean, there are about 130,000 petrol stations in Europe alone, and you do need to create some critical mass. How are you seeing kind of that minimum critical mass in terms of hydrogen stations out there, and how much do you think your electrolyzers will how much market share do you think they'll take in those future hydrogen stations?
I don't mind starting if I can turn the microphone on. It's on. Good. Okay. Can you hear me? I think it's clear that the hydrogen vehicles are now arriving, and being part of the UK Hydrogen Mobility Programme, there's a very organic process of trying to work out exactly what the hydrogen infrastructure should be and what it should consist of. I think one thing that we can point to is the conclusions that the German mobility programme reached, which was that 50% of the hydrogen ought to be renewable hydrogen, and that essentially means that it will come via an electrolyser. So I think that's quite an important marker, and I think if you're going to go to all of the effort to develop a car that can operate using a clean fuel and generate no emissions, you kind of shoot yourself in the foot if you use reformed natural gas and that you tanker around the country to refuel with. So I'm pretty optimistic that electrolysis will see a large portion of that market share. In terms of getting a critical mass, our focus for that is the Isle of Wight. It's a nice defined island system, and you can sometimes suffer a little bit of a mosaic approach where there's a lot of different things going on in different areas. And with the Isle of Wight, what we're trying to do is bring a lot of things all together in the same place so that you do create that critical mass. You've got a focal point, you've got the infrastructure that you would need to satisfy that particular island community. I think that's an important thing, to be able to bring everything together in the same place at the same time.
Well, thank you.
7 automotive companies have been spending between 100 million to 400 million a year in this area, and they're still doing it. So that's the first thing not to forget. The second thing, for an automotive company to actually be doing something in 2015, it means they were doing something very serious in an ordinary production 5 years before that, and for an R&D development task 10 years before that. And I can assure you, having seen it with my own eyes, that has all been happening. So the 2015 date is real. In terms of the magnitude, for a single model to be commercially acceptable for a typical automotive maker, about 50,000 vehicles a year is a typical production level. So we're not going to be in 2015 into, for any single maker, a full-on 50,000 unit production, but collectively we are going to pass that level with the various announcements and numbers that have been made known. And I think even in the last 2 days, the announcements from Toyota, which are very explicitly saying, we're not banking on EVs anymore. We're not seeing the volumes on EVs. We're looking at hybrids and fuel cells as the future of transportation. That announcement is to be taken seriously. Toyota does not make announcements carelessly or not carefully. And then the other dynamic that I think that's very interesting here is a dynamic between the Koreans and the Japanese. There's a very, very pitched battle now as to who's going to be first. And in the car industry, that's a very motivating psyche indeed. So this is going to happen. In terms of the fueling infrastructure, very detailed studies have been done in the areas where the infrastructure is going to show up, which is in Korea, Japan, and California, and Germany. The numbers would surprise you. Yes, there's hundreds of thousands of fueling stations throughout Europe on every corner, but to give adequate mobility or or very good mobility to the initial owners of these vehicles takes a surprisingly small number of stations. In the state of California, between San Francisco and LA, in the normal driving corridor, the calculation is 68 stations. It's not many. They already have about 30 built, and there are orders coming through in the next number of months for the additional 30 to 40 stations they require to get that first threshold level. In Germany, there are numbers of an additional 50 stations recently announced. That will also give very good mobility across a good geography in Germany. In Japan, the number is 100. So the starter kit for the infrastructure here is not the problem. The price of the station is not the problem. We're happy to sell them for a very reasonable price. The issue is who's going to pay? And so in every one of these jurisdictions, there's been a bit of a waiting game between the automotive makers and the local governments and those who have a stake in the fueling business as to who's going to pay for that infrastructure. And gradually more and more of it's getting built, but all the time they're looking as to who's going to pay, and that has slowed things down.
Paolo, would you like to add something to it? Or?
We are working on the very other side, small side of the scale, and it's more a do-it-yourself kind of situation. To enable scooters, at least at the introductory level, for instance, AFCT is looking at a green island in Taiwan. They will only need 3 these canister distributors around the island, and it can serve a large number of scooters.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Paolo. I think, well, I see a few hands. Let's start on this side. I'll move on and then move on to this.
David Hart, E4 Tech. I'd like to thank all of the panelists. Very interesting presentations. I've been doing hydrogen and fuel cell research and consulting for about 20 years now, and been through the hype cycles and been through all of the other things. And this question is a corollary to one that was asked in the earlier session and probably targeted directly at Daryl, but other comments welcome. There are a couple of markets which are real markets. You know, materials handling gets cited, telecoms backup is cited. The power to gas market is a real market, but is driven very strongly by curtailment payments and by other policy measures. How soon do the costs make sense if you take away some of those really strict policies? Where could you get to without that kind of incentive?
There are at least 4 and probably several more business models here, so they all have a different answer to your question. The driving force is renewable energy deployment, and it looks like that's a destination that we're all headed for. There might have been questions about that 2-3 years ago, and in Europe typically I would hear 20% by 2020. Now I hear open discussion of 100% renewable generation. If that's the destination, then storage is essential. So then the question comes as to what economic supports are required to make the whole thing work. In some of the business models, we're not showing any additional incentives for capacity of storage payments, but we are partly depending on the not so sensible economics of the current situation with some negative energy pricing, or certainly low pricing at certain times of the day. So long as a more free market, energy market style is taken, then price fluctuation is going to be part of that reality, including low prices. And we've shown that, you know, down in the 2-3 cents range, not zero or not negative, but down in the 2-3 cents a kilowatt hour range, which happens regularly now, the case can be made for the equipment, again, without capacity payments. And as I mentioned earlier, we're not counting on just single revenue streams here. There are multiple dimensions to the business model, including stabilization payments, and we're taking today's prices on stabilization payments. With increases in generation and renewables going up 2- and 3-fold, if a free market happened, those stabilization payments would also go up in value. And so it's a very dynamic situation, but I can assure you, having sat on the other side of the table from people much smarter than I, carefully looking at this in 2 major utility companies, this is a robust, sustainable business model, and people are putting money on it now. I know I haven't answered your question because the answer is not entirely available, but Sustainable business models exist here. We have that confidence, and so do our partners.
Okay, thank you. I think there was a question up there, and we'll finish with your question then afterwards. Yeah.
It all sounds very exciting, and maybe it could just take off. What's to stop the Chinese or anybody else coming in with a much cheaper solution because they roll it out and invest in it massively? Do you have what's to intellectual property protection and keeps your particular offering special?
Well, in our case, we do have a unique technology which is patented, and we have patents across many countries, including China.
I think we're probably all going to say we've got our own special technology that gives us advantages. I think it can be quite difficult to police protection of that, especially in far reaches of the world. But I think there's something about getting there first, making sure that you can get that initial momentum, and the space is kind of big enough for everybody. And I believe that in our own case we have a unique offering that does give us the edge that would take significant effort to emulate. So I'm going to hedge my bets a little bit and say that we have got some unique technology which gives us a significant cost advantage that goes beyond labour rates and so on and so forth. But I would say that the first move is important, and breaking through in that first instance gets you a good foothold.
We've just seen with very shocking speed how the impact of Chinese competition has impacted the solar industry. So this is not a simple matter. I take the question seriously. Part of our protection exists in patents related to energy systems and energy management. So it's not just about hardware, it's actually patents that go into the business model for doing this in the first place. We have extensive coverage for those business model and energy system patents, which is part of our protection and part of the reason that people work with us.
Okay, thank you. And just one last question, and then we'll break up for lunch.
Thank you. Mike Walter of Transportation Professional magazine. Quick question for Simon. I was fascinated to hear about the Eco Island project on the Isle of Wight. I gather that's 20 vehicles making use of a mobile hydrogen refuelling station. Can you explain to us the broad aims of that project, and perhaps share with us some of the discoveries you've made and perhaps any difficulties that you've encountered on that project?
Sure. Well, we're right at the front end of that project is perhaps the first thing I should say. But what we're attempting to do is integrate a whole bunch of things. So there's a lot of technology out there in terms of renewable energy harvesting, about vehicle drivetrains, about grid balancing and so on. And what the scheme is trying to do is bring all of those together and show a really tangible integrated system. And so the advantage of it being on an island is it's got a very distinct boundary, and so it makes it very good as an opportunity to study what takes place and how the whole thing operates. Really, we're aiming to provide a way of assimilating new renewable energy in a variety of forms, and being able to make intelligent decisions about what you do with it and when you do that. If you can use it straight away, clearly you do that. If you can't, there are some options. There's short-term storage in batteries. There's longer-term storage in terms of hydrogen, which we would then offer as a fuel for clean vehicles. Bringing all of those things together, making sure that the technologies are all robust in their own right, but they all can communicate with one another and they can all interact in an intelligent way is really the challenge. So each of the technologies are good. It's the glue that holds them together, and the intelligence to operate them as a symbiotic piece of kit is the real trick. We've got some good partners to do that with very well proven track records, so I'm confident about it, but it's now a case of building it and doing it and demonstrating to people that it can be a success.
Okay, well, thank you very much again to all the speakers, and we'll